Hi, my name is Mario Anthony Dialinas. What is your name?
My name is also Mario Anthony Dialinas.
What is your birth date, sir?
I was born on August 16, 1936.
Okay. Where were you born?
At St. Paul Street in Athens, Greece.
How would you say that in Greek?
Agios Pavlos.
What was life like in Greece before the war?
Although in Europe there was a turmoil, life in Greece was rather peaceful and normal, I would say, and nothing very exciting going on.
Okay. What was the economic status of Greece before the war?
Actually, it was poor in general, because Greece doesn't have any serious source of good economic activity. But at that time, the economy was in a very good progress under the regime of Metaxas government, and it was growing. The economy was growing.
Would you say Greece was more of an agricultural or an industrial country?
Definitely agricultural country. The industry in Greece was in a very infant condition.
Mm-hmm. So, what were primarily grown in Greece as far as agricultural?
Olives, olive oil, red beets, and then a little bit of grains and some tobacco.
Okay. What was Ohi Day?
On October 28, 1940, the Italian ambassador in Athens gave Metaxas an ultimatum to let Italian forces through the country, and Metaxas gave a laconic answer, Ohi, that means no.
What was it that Metaxas said which gave Ohi Day such significance?
Well, it was the courage to stand up against the might of the Axis, the first time in Europe.
What words did Metaxas say?
Well, after the Ohi, he said, alors, c'est la guerre, and that's in French.
What does that mean?
That means, well, now it's the war.
Why was this said in French?
Because at that time, that was the diplomatic language. French was the diplomatic language, and everybody was speaking in French.
After this, what was the reaction of the Athenians?
Well, it was enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, patriotic songs, and happiness. Happiness in the idea that liberty and victory would be in our side.
Okay. Do you remember any of the songs he sang?
Well, I remember most of them. The military marches and the songs that they were made by the Greek star singers, also paraphrasing Italian songs that combined patriotism and irony for Mussolini, who was called Il Duce, the Duke of Hazard.
What was the reaction of Mussolini?
Actually, he did not react. He had already acted, having his forces already 50 miles inside Greece. Nobody knew it because telephones were a rare commodity in remote mountainous villages. and small places that people used to gather for agricultural purposes.
What was the reaction of the Greeks?
They were all proud to suffer the consequences of an uncertain war for the sake of remaining free. And that was the main reaction, and then of course the enthusiasm and talking about, because up until that time they were not too much involved in the politics that were the daily history in Europe at that time.
How did your parents react?
Well, I remember my father went to the nearest police station to enlist a couple of hours after it was known that we are at war with Italy. And then I don't remember seeing him until a couple of 3 days later, when he came home driving a big army truck full of explosives and ammunition and stuff like that.
Did many Greeks do the same thing?
Yeah, most of them, because there was, everybody was going to report for duty up until maybe 50 years of age.
What was your reaction?
I was kind of excited. I was very excited, actually, with all the unusual happenings. Bells ringing, patriotic songs, radio announcements, and all of that good things. Of course, I was only 4.5 years old, but still I have a good memory of these unusual times.
How did the Greek victories in Albania affect the Italian military campaign?
The Italian soldiers' morale was totally demolished after the victories one after the other. Their morale was crushed and the campaign was no more.
Did the Italians retreat?
They were retreating and running back to Albania, the ones that they were not captured, because a lot of them, in thousands, were captured as prisoners of war.
Where were the victories in Albania?
Well, in towns, cities called Tepeleni, Elasona, Saint Saranda, and others, until the Greek forces reached the outskirts of the capital, Tirana.
How did the Albanians react to the Greek victories?
It looks like they were scared to death that they would be occupied by the Greek forces, and actually not having the opportunity to be the occupiers themselves on the side of the Italians. Now, the Albanians were a long time enemy of the Greeks, because they were Muslims and they were against the Greek population of Albania keeping their identity and religion, Greek Orthodox, and they thought that now the measurements they took against the Greeks, the Greek minority in Albania, it was going to be taken against themselves now. So they were scared that the Greeks would be bad occupiers in their land.
Did the Greeks actually punish the Albanians?
No, not at all. I mean, they were only, they care only about the campaign, how the war was going for them, and then they stayed only a very little time there, maybe weeks, a couple of 3 weeks before the the war moved back into Greece with the German attack.
So up to this point, everything was successful with the Greeks?
It was successful and it was glorious, actually, because the expectations that the Greek population had from their armed forces were justified, and everybody was in support of the troops. They were receiving the wounded and the returning tired soldiers back in the cities and Athens with a lot of love and care.
How did the Nazis initially react?
They were very, very angry with Mussolini and his attack against Greece, and mostly because he was defeated by a small country and a small army. In this case, they started having no respect for their partner in the Axis, the Italians.
Was this the end of the Italian campaign?
It was the end of the Italian campaign and the beginning of the Nazis campaign, that they reacted in assistance to the Mussolini's losses in Albania, and they could not accept the fact that there was the first defeat of the Axis forces in Europe, and so they started the campaign through Yugoslavia, coming down to the Greek borders, and the Greeks had to move from Albania towards the borders of Yugoslavia in order to meet the Germans. The Italians then returned and joined the Germans when the Germans came in the mainland of Greece.
How were the Allies involved after the Italian military campaign?
There was a British regiment stationed in Greece, in Athens. This regiment didn't take action in the Italian in the campaign in Albania, and they came in support of the Greeks, but they did not make it on time for the Albanian campaign, actually. And they went to Crete after the Germans started coming into the Greek mainland. And instead of fighting into the mainland, they went to Crete because Crete would be of serious importance in the Mediterranean. So they were stationed there, waiting for the Germans to attack Crete, the island of Crete.
How long did it take the Germans to occupy mainland Greece?
Well, it was approximately 15 to 20 days to get to Athens, and another 45 days to get to Crete. It was originally the first confrontation was in the northern part of Greece, where we had the Metaxas line.
What was the Metaxas line?
The Metaxas line was a fortification over the borders with Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. The main fort, though, was called Rupel, which was north of Thessaloniki, where the fighting got very intense and ugly. The Germans were trying to get this fort but the Ruppel resisted the German attacks one after the other for almost 3 weeks. Then the Greeks got out of ammunition, and they started coming out with a white flag, about 50 of them that they were left, and the Germans asked them to raise their flag, hold their flag, and keep their arms. The time they were coming in front of the German flag was lowered for the first time in history, recognizing the Greek heroism of keeping this fort for 45 days. Now, taking under consideration the fact that the Maginot Line in Paris lasted only 3 days, and the Germans went into Paris without any delay, this was a very important achievement during the German-Greek War.
What role did the island of Crete play during the war?
When the German forces were coming to Athens, the royal family was evacuated to Crete, along with most politicians and the remaining Greek armed forces. Also, the Greek gold depository was moved to Crete by the students of the Greek military academy in a safe place, so the Germans wouldn't get the little gold the Greeks had at that time to back their currency. From mid-April to end of May 1941, the Germans, under General Student, were heavily bombarding the island of Crete, and parachute drops were repeatedly made, but unsuccessfully in their effort to land. Finally, after 45 days, they established a foothold in Maleme Airport, which is right outside the city of Chania, Crete. And about the total of the remaining British regiment was surrendered to the Germans. Most of the British went to Egypt to continue the war in Africa, along with the royal family and the remaining of the Greek army. So after Crete, the Greeks had moved to Alexandria, Egypt, in order to enforce, the war efforts against the Germans in North Africa.
How did Greece's resistance affect the outcome of the war on the German Eastern Front?
The Greek resistance, and especially the one that was waged in Crete, is believed to have forced a very critical delay in the German plans to initiate invasion against the Soviet Union. And the Barbarossa plan was delayed considerably, and the campaign into the punishing Russian winter was a disaster, with extremely heavy losses for German paratroop forces in Crete for the planned German campaign in the Middle East against the British-held Iraq and its oil fields. Germany was delayed in a critical phase of the war in a way that not only the winter came up in Russia, but also the fact that the morale of the German army had started to fall.
What was Operation Barbarossa?
Barbarossa was the name of the strategic plans of Germany to invade and occupy Russia, which was scheduled for the beginning of summer of 1941, but due to all these delays in Crete, it came late in the summer and then ran into the autumn, where the Russian area there was under heavy snow and very freezing conditions, which led to a disaster of the German army there.
The Germans weren't accustomed to fighting in this weather, were they?
They were, yes, but they didn't have any supplies coming up. And they didn't have any medical assistance, and they were frozen with frostbites, and they just could not fight in this heavy Russian weather. Snow, okay, in Germany is different from the snow in Russia.
Yeah.
And the open country in Russia, where there was nothing for them to have a shelter or something.
And I assume they probably starved too.
Yeah, because they didn't have any supplies coming up.
How were the daily lives of the Greeks affected by Nazi occupation?
The life in Greece was radically changed. Most of the food, groceries, bread, etc. were taken by the Germans to feed their army and to supply their stores, the PXs, that the Germans were getting their food from. At the beginning, hundreds and then thousands were dying in the streets and carried to mass graves by donkey-hauled carts. As the years passed, the situation was worsening and the era of the Great Famine began.
What was the Great Famine called in Greek?
Megalos limos.
Was this similar to the Great Depression?
Yeah, it was right. It was similar to the Depression with the added fact that there were no jobs and they had the German boot over their heads with daily arrests and punishments and imprisonment and tortures and all of this stuff that an occupying force would do to protect, their forces' safety.
So in fact, this was worse.
It was, a little bit worse because in addition to the Great Famine and the loss of jobs and everything else, you had the foreign troops to torture and imprison most of the people that lived in the cities.
How did the 1943 surrender of Italy to the Allies affect the situation in Greece?
Well, suddenly from occupiers, the Italian soldiers became fellow sufferers after being imprisoned by the Germans and were loaded onto railroad cars for forced labor in Germany. They were passing through the streets of Athens in endless lines during the hard, cold winter, dressed in rags and hungry and thirsty. The Greeks were watching on the sidewalks as the Italians were passing by, and they would give them some bread, homemade cookies, and water, some scarves and hats here and there. This I remember very vividly. I was 8 years old then. Nothing else changed until finally the Germans left a year later.
So although the Italians had just got done being in a war with the Greeks were still sympathetic to the way the Germans were treating them.
Yeah, because the Italians now became enemies to the Germans too. So they changed the situation completely. And besides, I mean, they were suffering the same way the Greeks were suffering. So they shared a little bit of bread, a little bit of cookies, water, and whatever they could, do in order to have their suffering reduced.
Yeah. So much for the Italian occupation. How did the German and Bulgarian occupation end?
The Bulgarian occupation ended a little bit before the German occupation. The Bulgarians, mainly occupying the northern part of Greece, Macedonia and Thrace, retreated under the pressure of the Greek partisan resistance that pushed them back to Bulgaria. That occurred during the spring and summer of 1944. By the end of November 1944, the Germans suddenly boarded endless train columns and headed back to Germany through Yugoslavia and Austria. The Greeks were watching in astonishment this massive evacuation, speechless but elated.
What followed the liberation politically?
Well, the British established a governing authority at the beginning, waiting for the Greek government to arrive from Egypt and take over. The Greek royal family also returned, following a relative public vote, and then the Greek army returned by mid-April of 1945 from their campaigns in El Alamein, Africa, and Rimini in Italy, as part of the Allied forces. However, the Communist Party's resistance fighters tried to take over the government and establish an Iron Curtain state. A civil war then began, which lasted 4 years and ended with the victory of the National Democratic Forces by mid-1949.
Why did the Greek civil conflict last 4 years?
Well, because the communist forces were very strong in many parts of Greece. With the British, believe it or not, helping with ammunition and money, English golden pounds in cases, dropped over with parachutes over both areas, the Democratic National Forces and the communist areas, thus becoming a bloody and endless conflict. This situation ended with the positive help given by the United States to the National Democratic Forces.
What were the greatest economic changes after the liberation?
Well, first was the massive effort to reconstruct the economy, taking the right measurements with the redevelopment of the agricultural section. The economy in general would either delay or not be being possible at all if the United States would not assist us. And then a miracle occurred under the name of Marshall Plan, which gave the Greek economy the push it desperately needed at that time, as did all other European countries affected by this war. So the great economic change was the reconstruction of the Greek economy by the help of the Marshall Plan.
How did the United States help Greece rebuild its infrastructure?
Well, the Marshall Plan first provided the means for rebuilding the limited industrial enterprises to a great extent, actually. Then modernize the agricultural procedures, but most of all by helping the Greek merchant fleet with the allocation of 100 Liberty ships that were no longer in use by the U.S. Merchant Marine after the end of the war.
How long did it take before Greece was politically stabilized?
Well, it took approximately 4 years of civil war before the political status was stabilized in Greece.
Is there any animosity left over amongst the countries involved in this conflict?
There is animosity against the Italian fascists and the German Nazis, but not toward the people of these countries. As a matter of fact, the Greeks had a good cooperation with both countries after the war ended, and today, of course, they all are members of the European Union.
What was your most vivid impression of this era?
Of course, first of all, the Great Famine, one, and then by the end of the German occupation, I was 7 or 8 years old, when I participated in a kind of resistance in Athens. Some older kids helped 2 of us on a German army truck loaded with tires and told us to drop the tires off on the street. It was night time, in an effort to sabotage their carpools. We had proceeded almost with emptying 1/4 approximately of the truck's load when suddenly the truck stopped. 2 soldiers came out, grabbed us, and threw us on the tarmac and kicked us several times and left us there. Then some neighbors came and picked us up and treated our wounds, but they didn't kill us.
Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your memories with us.
You're quite welcome.